All right. Good morning, afternoon, boys and girls. So I went to work today and I got the same copy that I sent over with you guys, so we won't have any more confusion with what page we're on. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the first part of the reading with that. The first 13 pages I think we got through. We talked about the scar and we met some people. We met Ralph and Piggy. And we know he used that conch to find some more boys, and there was a whole bunch of them that came. So with that, remember Ralph or Piggy was trying to remember all the names, but there was just too many of them. So with that, I told you yesterday when I left off that we were on page 20 on my book. We are going to be at the top of page 21. Remember Meridu came in with his group that was like army-like, in line and marching, and they were getting ready to join in. And Meridu asked Ralph if there were any grown-ups, and his answer was no. So we are at the top of page 21. So let's get to reading, shall we? Meridu sat down on a trunk and looked around the circle. Then we'll have to look after ourselves. Secure on the other side of Ralph, Piggy spoke timidly. That's why Ralph made a meeting, so as we can decide what to do. We heard names. That's Johnny. Those two, they're twins, Sam and Eric. Where is Eric? You. No, you're Sam. I'm Sam, and I'm Eric. We'd better all have names, said Ralph. So I'm Ralph. We got most names, said Piggy. Got 'em just now. Kids' names, said Meridu. Why should I be Jack? I'm Meridu. Ralph turned to him quickly. This was the voice of one who knew his own mind. Then, went on Piggy, that boy. I forget. You're talking too much, said Jack Meridu. Shut up, fatty. Laughter arose. He's not fatty, cried Ralph. His real name's Piggy. Piggy, Piggy, oh Piggy. A storm of laughter arose, and even the tiniest child joined in. For the moment, the boys were closed circuit of sympathy with Piggy outside. He went very pink, bowed his head, and cleaned his glasses again. Finally, the laughter died away, and the naming continued. There was Maurice, next in size among the choir boys to Jack, but broad and grinning all the time. There was a slight, furtive boy whom no one knew, who kept to himself with the inner intensity of avoidance and secrecy. He muttered that his name was Roger and was silent again. Bill, Robert, Harold, Henry. The choir boy who had fainted sat up against a palm tree, smiled pallidly at Ralph, and said his name was Simon. Jack spoke. We've got to decide about being rescued. There was a buzz. One of the small boys, Henry, said that he wanted to go home. Shut up, said Ralph absently. He lifted the conch. Seems to me we ought to have a chief to decide things. A chief, a chief. I ought to be chief, said Jack with simple arrogance, because I'm chapter chorister and head boy. I can sing C sharp. Another buzz. Well then, said Jack, He hesitated. The dark boy Roger stirred at last and spoke up. Let's have a vote. Yes, vote for chief. Let's vote. This toy of voting was almost as pleasing as the conch. Jack started to protest, but the clamor changed from the general wish for a chief to an election by acclaim of Ralph himself. None of the boys could have found good reason for this. What intelligence had been shown was traceable to Piggy, while the most obvious leader was Jack. But there was a stillness about Ralph as he sat that marked him out. There was his size and attractive appearance, and most obscurely, yet most powerfully, there was the conch, the being that had blown that, had sat waiting for them on the platform with the delicate thing balanced on his knees, was set apart. Him with the shell. Ralph! Ralph! Let him be chief with the trumpet thing. Ralph raised a hand in silence. All right, who wants Jack for chief? Excuse me. With dreary obedience, the choir raised their hands. Who wants me? Every hand outside the choir except Piggy's was raised immediately. Then Piggy, too, raised his hand grudgingly into the air. Ralph counted. I'm chief, then. The circle of boys broke into applause. Even the choir applauded, and the freckles on Jack's face disappeared under a blush of mortification. He started up, then changed his mind and sat down again while the air rang. Ralph looked at him, eager to offer something. The choir belongs to you, of course. They could be the army or hunters. They could be... The suffusion drained away from Jack's face. Ralph waved again for silence. Jack's in charge of the choir. They can be... What do you want them to be? Hunters? Jack and Ralph smiled at each other with shy liking. The rest began to talk eagerly. Jack stood up. All right, choir, take off your togs. As if released from class, the choir boys stood up, chattered, piled their back cloaks on the grass. Jack laid his on the trunk by Ralph. His gray shorts were sticking to him with sweat. Ralph glanced at them admiringly, and when Jack saw his glance, he explained, I tried to get over that hill to see if there was water all around, but your shell caught us. Ralph smiled and held up the conch for silence. Listen, everybody, I've got to have time to think things out. I can't decide what to do straight off. If this isn't an island, we might be rescued straight away. So we've got to decide if this is an island. Everybody must stay around here and wait and not go away. 3 of us, if we take more, will get all mixed and lose each other. 3 of us will go on an expedition and find out. I'll go, and Jack, and... He looked around the circle of eager faces. There was no lack of boys to choose from. And Simon. The boys round Simon giggled, and he stood up, laughing a little. Now that the pallor of his faint was over, he was a skinny, vivid little boy with a glance coming up from under the hut of straight hair that hung down, black and coarse. He nodded at Ralph. I'll come. And I? Jack snatched from behind him a sizable sheath knife and clouded it into a trunk. The buzz rose and died away. Piggy stirred. I'll come. Ralph turned to him. You're no good on a job like this. All the same. We don't want you, said Jack flatly. 3's enough. Piggy's glasses flashed. I was with him when he found the conch. I was with him before anyone else was. Jack and the others paid no attention. There was a general dispersal. Ralph, Jack, and Simon jumped off the platform and walked along the sand past the bathing pool. Piggy hung bumbling behind them. If Simon walks in the middle of us, said Ralph, then we could talk over his head. The 3 of them fell into step. This meant that every now and then Simon had to do a double shuffle to catch up with the others. Presently, Ralph stopped and turned back to Piggy. Look. Jack and Simon pretended to notice nothing. They walked on. You can't come. Piggy's glasses were misted again, this time with humiliation. You told him, after what I said. His face flushed, his mouth trembled. After I said I didn't want... What on earth are you talking about? About being called Piggy. I said I didn't care as long as they didn't call me Piggy. And I said not to tell, and then you went and said straight out. Stillness descended on them. Ralph, looking with more understanding at Piggy, saw that he was hurt and crushed. He hovered between the 2 courses of apology or further insult. Better Piggy than Fatty, he said at last, with the directness of genuine leadership. And anyway, I'm sorry if you feel like that. Now go back, Piggy, and take names. That's your job. So long. He turned and raced after the other 2. Piggy stood and the rose of indignation faded slowly from his cheeks. He went back to the platform. The three boys walked briskly on the sand. The tide was low, so there was a strip of weed-strewn beach that was almost as firm as a road. A kind of glamour was spread over them and the scene, and they were conscious of glamour and made happy by it. They turned to each other, laughing excitedly, talking, not listening. The air was bright. Ralph faced by the task of translating all this into an explanation, stood on his head and fell over. When they had done laughing, Simon stroked Ralph's arm shyly, and they had to laugh again. "Come on," said Jack presently. "We're explorers. We'll go to the end of the island," said Ralph, "and look around the corner, if it is an island." Now, toward the end of the afternoon, the mirages were settling a little. They found the end of the island quite distinct and not magicked out of shape or sense. There was a jumble of the usual squareness, with one great block sitting out in the lagoon. Seabirds were nesting there, like icing, said Ralph, on a pink cake. "We shan't see around this corner," said Jack, "because there isn't one, only a slow curve. You can see the rocks get worse." Ralph shaded his eyes and followed a jagged line of crags toward the mountain. This part of the beach was nearer the mountain than any other that they had seen. "We'll try climbing the mountain from here," he said. "I should think this is the easiest way. There's less of that jungly stuff and more pink rock. Come on." The three boys began to scramble up. Some unknown force had wrenched and shattered these cubes so that they lay askew, often piled diminishingly on each other. The most unusual feature of the rock was a pink cliff surmounted by a skewed block, and that again surmounted, and that again, till the pinkness became a stack of balanced rock projecting through the looped fantasy of the forest creepers. Where the pink cliffs rose out of the ground, there were often narrow tracks winding upwards. They could edge along them, deep in the plant world, their faces to the rock. "What made this track?" Jack paused, wiping the sweat from his face. Ralph stood by him, breathless. "Men?" Jack shook his head. "Animals?" Ralph peered into the darkness under the trees. The forest minutely vibrated. "Come on." The difficulty was not the steep ascent round the shoulders of rock, but the occasional plunges through the undergrowth to get to the next path. Here the roots and stems of creepers were in such tangles that the boys had to thread through them like pliant needles. Their only guide, apart from the brown ground and occasional flashes of light through the foliage, was a tendency of slope. Whether this hole, laced as it was with cables of creeper, stood higher than that. Somehow they moved. Immured in these tangles, at perhaps their most difficult moment, Ralph turned with shining eyes to the others. Wacko, Wizard, Smashing. The cause of their pleasure was not obvious. All three were hot, dirty, and exhausted. Ralph was badly scratched. The creepers were as thick as the thighs and left little but tunnels for further penetration. Ralph shouted experimentally, and they listened to the muted echoes. "This is real exploring," said Jack. I bet nobody's been here before." "We ought to draw a map," said Ralph. "Only we haven't any paper." "We couldn't make scratches on bark," said Simon, "and rub black stuff on it." "We could make scratches on bark," said Simon, "and rub black stuff in." Again came the solemn communion of shining eyes in the gloom. Wacko, Wizard. There was no place for standing on one's head. This time Ralph expressed the intensity of his emotion by pretending to knock Simon down, and soon there were happy heaving pile in the underdusk. When they had fallen apart, Ralph spoke first. Gotta get on. The pink granite of the next cliff was farther back from the creepers and trees so they could trot up the path. This again led into more open forest so that they had a glimpse of spread sea. With openness came the sun. It dried the sweat and they had soaked their clothes in the dark, damp heat. At last, the way to the top looked like a scramble over pink rock. With no more plunging through darkness, the boys chose their way through defiles and over heaps of sharp stone. Look! Look! High over this end of the island, the shattered rocks lifted up their stacks and chimneys. This one, against which Jack leaned, moved with a grating sound when they pushed. Come on, but not come on to the top. The assault of the summit must wait while the three boys accepted the challenge. The rock was as large as a small motor car. Heave! Sway back and forth. Catch the rhythm. Heave! Increase the swing with the pendulum. Increase. Come up and bear against the point of furthest. Balance. Increase. Heave! The great rock loitered, poised on one toe, decided not to return, moved through the air, fell, struck, turned over, leapt droning through the air, and smashed a deep hole in the canopy of the forest. Echoes and birds flew. White and pink dust floated. The forest further down shook as with the passage of an enraged monster. And then the island was still. Wacko! Like a bomb. Woo! Not for 5 minutes could they drag themselves away from this triumph, but they left at last. The way to the top was easy after that. As they reached the last stretch, Ralph stopped. Golly! They were on the lip of a circular hollow in the side of the mountain. This was filled with a blue flower, a rock plant of some sort, and the overflow hung down the vent and spilled lavishly among the canopy of the forest. The air was thick with butterflies, lifting, fluttering, and settling. Beyond the hollow was a square top of the mountain, and soon they were standing on it. They had guessed before that this was an island. Clambering among the pink rocks, with the sea on the other side and the crystal heights of air, they had known by some instinct that the sea lay on every side. But there seemed something more fitting in leaving the last word till they stood on the top and could see a circular horizon of water. Ralph turned to the others. This belongs to us. It was roughly boat-shaped, humped near this end, with behind them the jumbled descent to the shore. On either side rocks, cliffs, treetops, and a steep slope. Forward there, the length of the boat, a tamered descent, tree-clad with hints of pink, and then the jungly flat of the island, dense green, but drawn at the end into a pink tail. There, where the island petered out in the water, was another island, a rock almost detached, standing like a fort, facing them across the green with one bold pink bastion. The boys survived all this, then looked out to sea. They were high up, and the afternoon had advanced. The view was not robbed of sharpness by mirage. That's a reef, a coral reef. I've seen pictures like that. The reef enclosed more than one side of the island, lying perhaps a mile out and parallel to what they thought of as their beach. The coral was scribbled in the sea as though a giant had bent down to reproduce the shape of the island in a flowing chalk line, but tired before he had finished. Inside was peacock water, rocks and weeds showing as in an aquarium. Outside was the dark blue of the sea. The tide was running so that long streaks of foam tailed away from the reef, and for a moment they felt like the boat was moving steadily astern. Jack pointed down. "That's where we landed." Beyond falls and cliffs, there was a gash visible in the trees. There were splintered trunks, and then the drag, leaving only a fringe of palm between the scar and the sea. There, too, jutting into the lagoon, was the platform, with insect-like figures moving near it. Ralph sketched a twining line from the bald spot on which they stood down the slope, a gully through flowers, round and down to the rock where the scar started. "That's the quickest way back." Eyes shining, mouths open, triumphant, they savored their rights of domination. They were lifted up, were friends. There's no village smoke and no boats," said Ralph. Wisely, "We'll make sure later, but I think it's uninhabited." "We'll get food," cried Jack. "Hunt, catch things until they fetch us." Simon looked at them both, saying nothing but nodding, till his black hair flopped backwards and forwards. His face was glowing. Ralph looked down the other way where there was no reef. "Steeper," said Jack. Ralph made a cupping gesture. "That bit of forest down there, the mountain holds it up." Every point of the mountain held up trees, flowers, and trees. Now the forest stirred, roared, flailed. The near acres of rock flowers fluttered for half a minute. The breeze blew cool on their faces. Ralph spread his arms. "All ours." They laughed and tumbled and shouted on the mountain. "I'm hungry." When Simon mentioned his hunger to the others became aware of theirs. "Come on," said Ralph. "We found out what we wanted to know." They scrambled down a rock slope, dropped among the flowers, and made their way under the trees. Here they paused and examined the bushes round them curiously. Simon spoke first. "Like candles. Candle bushes. Candle buds." The bushes were dark evergreen and aromatic, and the many buds were waxen green and folded up against the light. Jack slashed at one of them with his knife, and the scent spilled over them. "Candle buds. You couldn't light them," said Ralph. "They just look like candles." "Green candles," said Jack contemptuously. "We can't eat them. Come on." They were in the beginning of the thick forest, plonking with weary feet on a track, when they heard the noises, squeakings, and the hard strike of hoofs on a path. As they pushed forward, the squeaking increased till it became a frenzy. They found a piglet caught in a curtain of creepers, throwing itself in elastic traces in all the madness of extreme terror. Its voice was thin, needle-sharp, and insistent. The three boys rushed forward, and Jack drew his knife again with a flourish. He raised his arm in the air. There came a pause, a hiatus. The pig continued to scream and the creepers to jerk, and the blade continued to flash at the end of a bony arm. The pause was only long enough for them to understand what an enormity the downward stroke would be. Then the piglet tore loose from the creepers and scurried into the undergrowth. They were left looking at each other in the place of terror. Jack's face was white under the freckles. He noticed that he still held the knife aloft and brought his arm down, replacing the blade into the sheath. Then all three laughed ashamedly and began to climb back to the track. "I was choosing a place," said Jack. "I was just waiting for a moment to decide where to stab him." You should stick a pig," said Ralph fiercely. "They always talk about sticking a pig." "You cut a pig's throat to let it bleed out," said Jack. "Otherwise you can't eat the meat. Why didn't you?" They knew very well why he hadn't. Because of the enormity of the knife descending and cutting into living flesh. Because of the unbearable blood. "I was going to," said Jack. "He was ahead of them, and they could not see his face. I was choosing a place next time." He snatched his knife out of the sheath and slammed it into the tree trunk. Next time there would be no mercy. He looked around fiercely, daring them to contradict. That they broke out into the sunlight, and for a while they were busy finding and devouring food as they moved down the scar toward the platform of the meeting. And that is chapter 1. So they went on an adventure, the three of them, Jack and Ralph and Simon, to go search the outing and to go search what they thought was an island and did conclude that it was an island. So, all right. I believe your packet of questions is chapter 1 and 2. So after we finish chapter 2, After we finish chapter 2, I'll kind of talk about the questions with you. So, with that being said, I will start chapter 2. Fire on the Mountain. By the time Ralph finished blowing the conch, the platform was crowded. There was a difference between this meeting and the one held in the morning. The afternoon sun slanted in from the other side of the platform, and most of the children, feeling too late the smart of sunburn, had put their clothes on. The choir, noticeably less of a group, had discarded their cloaks. Ralph sat on a fallen trunk and his left side to the sun. On his right were most of the choir. On his left, the larger boys who had not known each other before the evacuation. Before him, small children squatted in the grass. Silence now. Ralph lifted the cream and pink shell to his knees, and sudden breeze scattered light over the platform. He was uncertain whether to stand up or remain sitting. He looked sideways to his left, toward the bathing pool. Piggy was sitting near, but giving no help. Ralph cleared his throat. Well then. All at once he found he could talk fluently and explain what he had to say. He passed a hand through his fair hair and spoke. We're on an island. We've been on the mountaintop and seen water all around. We saw no houses, no smoke, no footprints, no boats, no people. We're on an uninhabited island with no other people on it. Jack broke in. All the same you need an army for hunting pigs. Yes, there are pigs on the island. All three of them tried to convey the sense of pink live things struggling in the creepers. We saw, squealing. It broke away before I could kill it, but next time. Jack slammed his knife in the trunk and looked around challengingly. The meeting settled down again. So you see, said Ralph, we need hunters to get us meat. And another thing. He lifted the shell on his knees and looked around the sun-slashed faces. There aren't any grown-ups. We shall have to look after ourselves. The meeting hummed and was silent. And another thing. We can't have everybody talking at once. We'll have to have hands up like at school. He held the conch before his face and glanced around the mouth. Then I'll give him the conch. Conch? That's what this shell's called? I'll give the conch to the next person to speak. He can hold it when he's speaking. But look, and he won't be interrupted except by me. Jack was on his feet. We'll have rules, he cried excitedly. Lots of rules. Then when anyone breaks them, whoo, hacko, bong, doink. Ralph felt the conch lifted from his lap. Then Piggy was standing, cradling the great cream shell, and the shouting died down. Jack, left on his feet, looked uncertainly at Ralph, who smiled and patted the log. Jack sat down. Piggy took off his glasses and blinked at the assembly while he wiped them on his shirt. You're hindering Ralph. You're not letting him get to the most important thing. He paused effectively. Who knows we're here, eh? They knew at the airport, the man with the trumpet thing. My dad. Piggy put on his glasses. Nobody knows we're here, said Piggy. He was paler than before and breathless. Perhaps they knew where we was going to, and perhaps not. But they don't know where we are because we never got there. He gaped at them for a moment, then swayed and sat down. Ralph took the conch from his hands. That's what I was going to say, he went on. When you all, he gazed at their intent faces. The plane was shot down in flames. Nobody knows where we are, and we may be here a long time. The silence was so complete that they could hear the unevenness of Piggy's breathing. The sun slanted in and lay golden over half the platform. The breezes that on the lagoon had chased their tails like kittens were finding their way across the platform and into the forest. Ralph pushed back and tangled of fair hair that hung on his forehead. So, we may be here a long time. Nobody said anything, he grinned suddenly. But this is a good island. We, Jack, Simon, and me, we climbed the mountain. It's wizard. There's food and drink, and rocks, blue flowers. Piggy, partly recovered, pointed to the conch in Ralph's hands, and Jack and Simon fell silent. Ralph went on. While we're waiting, we can have a good time on this island. He gesticulated widely. It's like in a book. At once there was clamor. Treasure Island. Swallows and Amazons. Coral Island. Ralph waved the conch. This is our island. It's a good island until the grown-ups come to fetch us, and we'll have fun. Jack held out his hand for the conch. There's pigs, he said. There's food and bathing water and a little stream along there and everything. Didn't anyone find anything else? He handed the conch back to Ralph and sat down. Apparently no one had found anything. The older boys first noticed the child when he resisted. There was a group of little boys urging him forward, and he did not want to go. He was a shrimp of a boy, about 6 years old, and one side of his face was blotted by the mulberry-colored birthmark. He stood now, warped out of the perpendicular by the fierce light of publicity, and he bored into the coarse grass with one toe. He was muttering and about to cry. The other little boys, whispering but serious, pushed him toward Ralph. All right, said Ralph. Come on, then. The small boy looked around in panic. Speak up. The small boy held out his hand for the conch, and the assembly shouted with laughter. At once, he snatched back his hands and started to cry. Let him have the conch, shouted Piggy. Let him have it. At last, Ralph induced him to hold the shell, but by then the blow of laughter had taken away the child's voice. Piggy knelt by him, one hand on the great shell, listening and interpreting to the assembly. He wants to know what you're going to do about the snake thing. Ralph laughed, and the other two boys laughed with him. The small boy twisted further into himself. Tell us about the snake thing. Now he says it was a beastie. Beastie? A snake thing? Ever so big. He saw it. Where? In the woods? Either the wandering breezes or perhaps the decline of the sun allowed a little coolness to lie under the trees. The boys felt it and stirred restlessly. You couldn't have a beastie, a snake thing, on an island this size, Ralph explained kindly. You only get them in big countries like Africa or India. Murmur, and the grave nodding of heads. He says the beastie came in the dark. Then he couldn't see it. Laughter and cheers. Did you hear that? Says he saw the thing in the dark. He still says he saw the beastie. It came and went away again and came back and wanted to eat him. He was dreaming. Laughing, Ralph looked for a confirmation round the ring of faces. The older boys agreed, but here and there among the little ones was the doubt that required more than rational assurance. He must have had a nightmare, stumbling about among all those creepers. More grave nodding. They knew about nightmares. He says he saw the beastie, the snake thing, and will come back. It will come back tonight. But there isn't a beastie. He says in the morning it turned into them things like ropes in the trees and hung in the branches. He says it will come back tonight, but there isn't a beastie. There was no laughter at all now, and more grave watching. Ralph pushed both hands through his hair, and looked at the little boy in a mixed amusement and exasperation. Jack seized the conch. Ralph's right, of course. There isn't a snake thing, but there is. But if there was a snake, we'd hunt it and kill it. We're going to hunt pigs and get meat for everybody, and we'll look for a snake too. But there isn't a snake. All right, guys, I'm going to stop right there. We are at the top of page 37. So as we read into, let's see, about 10 more pages in this chapter, but I want you to think about your questions going into this chapter while we finish up here. I say we're at the top of 37. I already had a question this morning. I stopped in and saw somebody had to run something up to an apartment. They asked me about this question here. Find 3 subtle suggestions the author gives that the island may not be the paradise the boys expect. So earlier in chapter 1, they talked about 3 things. They gave 3 little hints that might make the island scary. So think about that. And I'll give you a hint. We talked about one of them, talking about the scar in the island. You know, this where he talked about that's where it went down and how it just tore down trees and things like that. So that's one of them. So there's 2 other hints they gave you, and that the island might be a little bit more scary than the other ones. So, like I said, when we finish chapter 2, we can go over these questions a little bit more. We can FaceTime, Google Meet, something like that if you want to review the questions more. So, with that, I am done for day 2. That means 18 days of summer school left. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you all tomorrow.